All right,
So, are we,
welcome everyone to the Classical Forum for Contemporary Issues. I'm going to introduce your host, Gabriel Dancing, who will introduce the speaker.
okay. Thank you, Sophia. Yeah, this is the welcome everyone to this forum, which is really devoted to discussing contemporary issues in a friendly and serious way. Um, uh, uh, all kinds of issues we've been addressing. It was sparked by the reactions to October 7th. But since then, we've been discussing a whole range of issues, and we invite everyone to continue to attend our events if they want to be able to discuss things without arguments and anger. Public accusations that genocide is being committed in Gaza have become one of the most contentious issues in global public life today. The rhetoric surrounding this charge and the powerful emotions it elicits from people around the world is extraordinary in both its intensity and its stakes, because the allegation of genocide carries not just legal meaning, but moral and historical weight that resonates through the generations. This polarization reflects more than disagreement over facts. It reveals deep differences in how international law, evidence, and moral language are understood and mobilized in the modern media and diplomatic environment. Given the seriousness of the charges and their implications for international justice, it's striking how little methodologically rigorous scholarly research has been published that examines the genocide allegations, its legal basis, evidentiary standards, and claims and counterclaims. It's therefore an honor to have Professor Danny Orbach with us today to address this gap. Professor Orbach brings sustained analytic rigor to questions that are often discussed emotionally or retrospectively. Together with his team of researchers, he has devoted hundreds, if not thousands, of hours to analyze all the relevant material in a methodologically transparent and academically rigorous manner. By doing so, he helps clarify what can and what cannot be responsibly concluded about these charges and the consequential issues. Please, Danny, it's an honor to have you here.
Okay, I'll say just two more words about myself. I hold two hats in the Hebrew University. I'm a military historian of the modern world, and I'm also a historian of modern Japan. But recently, I'm dealing more and more with Europe and the Middle East. This is a collaborative work. What you're going to see, along with my colleagues, Gil Henkin, Jonathan Boxman, and Jonathan Braverman. Me and Yagil are military historians. Jonathan Boxman is a quantitative analyst, and advocate Jonathan Braverman is an expert of international humanitarian law. So this is a multidisciplinary project of people who came from a very large variety of expertise. So our work was designed to rigorously examine the allegations that Israel had committed a genocide in Gaza. And also how a consensus that, in our opinion, is not corroborated by the facts, was formed around this question. So this is not only a story of the Gaza war. I see that there are many philosophers here. This is also a story on epistemology. How events are being constructed in a false way through the dissemination, I would say circular dissemination, of inaccurate knowledge that becomes a consensus which is impossible or very, very difficult to deny. So what I will present today is not all the points we cover in our study. This is a lot more than I can do in 1 hour. And Gabriel, I guess you sent the study to everybody, right? The link to the study, and if not, we'll do it after the lecture. I'll present our study in a nutshell. Then I'll dwell a little bit on our basic assumptions, methodological assumptions, intellectual assumptions behind this work. Then we'll delve into some of the issues, and the issue I'll delve in more detail is the question of starvation. We'll also speak about urban warfare, indiscriminate bombings. We'll ask, were the humanitarian zones in Gaza safer? You will see that it's a key issue. And then we'll try to speak about the way in which fallacious knowledge was disseminated and forced a kind of a global consensus, especially in academia. And my guide here, as to many other things, is this amazing, in my opinion, quote from Galileo's A Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Only the blind need guides in open and level fields. Learn from the writing of Aristotle, but do not bow your heads to his authority. Use reasoning, whether yours or Aristotle's, and not quotes or authorities, for we are dealing with our sensory world, not a world of paper. Why do I mention it? Because too many of our rivals are relying too much on authorities and quotes and citations. A typical article speaking about the genocide in Gaza will say, people in Gaza were starved as argued by the United Nations. Israel is committing genocide as argued by the independent UN Commission of Inquiry. Gaza was starving as the IPC said. Gaza was starving as the eminent scholar Alex de Waal said. And we want arguments. We don't deal with authorities, and certainly not authorities that cite one another. In our opinion, it's a very, very inferior way of doing scholarship. What is our basic assumptions? First of all, we began the study in a rather unorthodox way. Many of our readers believe that, as you know, our title is Debunking Genocide Allegations. Actually, we gave this title very late. Only after we finished the study for long, we didn't know what the title would even be. In such a study, the most orthodox way to begin will be to begin with a definitional chapter on the legal and scholarly definitions of genocide, and then trying to prove that the Israeli case does not apply, or to check whether it applies or does not apply. We think it's wrong. Because when you are saying the word genocide before you even began your inquiry, the mind of the reader is anchored to believe that there is a truth in the accusation. And this is just what we are going to check. I will answer questions, if possible, at the end of the talk. It will make things easier. And so what we wanted to do, we said, okay, before you start a criminal investigation, you need some basic evidence that at least there is a serious suspicion that there was a crime. So our investigation, in a way, is a preliminary investigation. Without even reaching the debate about the actual definitions of genocide, we want to see if there is enough suspicion to warrant an investigation. So what we assumed is that there is something which is common to all cases of genocide. In all cases of genocide, there is a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, necessary condition. The perpetrating state tried to kill as many victims as possible. At least it killed them intentionally, and at the very, very, very least was indifferent to their death. There are no cases of genocide in history where the perpetrating state made effort to spare lives of enemy civilians. And this is the crux of our preliminary investigation. Did Israel try to deliberately kill as many Gazans as possible or not? If the answer is no, Israel did not try to deliberately kill as many Gazan innocent civilians as possible, then we are not even at the realm of discussing the definitions of genocide. But even if Israel did try to kill as many civilians as possible, it's not necessarily a genocide as well. The Allies in the Second World War tried to kill as many German and Japanese civilians as they could, and it's still nobody defines it as a genocide. But if you prove that the perpetrating states did try to kill as many civilians as possible, in such a case, one should start to discuss the definitions of genocide and see if they apply. And the way we try to check whether there was such an attempt to deliberately kill as many civilians as possible was by examining three different questions. Did Israel try to starve the population? Did it engage in frontal massacres of innocent civilians? And did it engage in indiscriminate bombings? Our methodology is quantitative, statistical, and comparative analysis. We're interested in numbers. And as historians do, juxtaposition of all available sources, Israeli, international, and Palestinian, but very clearly, we prefer primary sources to secondary sources. Speaking about starvation, for example, I really don't care what the eminent famine scholar Alex Deval said. Well, I care, but this is not a piece of evidence. I am interested on numbers on malnutrition in Gaza. So we are always looking for the basic, the primary sources, and we try to cross-verify and juxtapose them with preference to forensic sources, primary forensic sources, aerial photos, original documents, numbers, things that we can check and verify. As for the structure of our study, our longest chapter by far, chapter 1, deals with the question of starvation. The second chapter deals with urban warfare and Hamas human shield strategy. Then we turn to the question of massacre and deliberate killing. We examine at least 60 dozens of incidents with 61 victims forensically, each and every one of them. Then we turn to the question of indiscriminate bombings. A very tough question we deal with in chapter 5 is the question of casualties. We try to assess the reliability of virtually the only source we have on the number of Gazan casualties, which is the Palestinian, that is Hamas, Gaza Ministry of Health. And then we try to offer a speculation of our own, how many civilians were killed, how many enemy combatants. But I will say also here, because I will not deal with the question in this particular talk, we remained with a lot of question marks. We didn't reach a definitive answer, and we believe that we will not reach a definitive answer in the coming years, though I have a reason to suspect that new documents will be released soon that will share some important light on this question, but I cannot say more than this. And here is a very good time to say our principle in this study, and we didn't break this principle, was to rely only on open evidence. So I will never tell you, I rely on a secret IDF document that say XYZ, though I know many such documents, but I will not rely on them in this study because I think it's unfair. Because, you need to be able to check and cross-verify everything I say. In chapters 6 and 7, we move out of the Gaza subject. We already established by the end of chapter 5 that many things that are being said about the Gaza war are factually wrong. And then we try to see how it happened in previous cases. And we show, for example, that in the case of the UN sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s, there is a common version in scholarship, which you can still read today in scholarly books and articles, and certainly in the media, that hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children died from malnutrition due to the UN sanctions. This is wrong. It's a lie. It's not even exaggerated. We have the Iraqi census data. And we just know that it was an invention of the Saddam regime, and still it became an international consensus. And we try to explain how and why. We do the same in chapter 7 for several smaller test cases, like the massacre in Jenin and the Lebanon war in 2006, Operation Cast Lead, and Operation Defensive Shield. And at the end, a protective age, sorry. And at the end, we try to examine how this false consensus emerged. We call it the inverted funnel of information, and we will reach this point in the end of this talk. The main question I would like to speak about is the question of starvation. And here, our research question is, did Israel starve the population of Gaza deliberately? And when we try to answer this question, we divide the period into several parts. Decided to stop completely.
Dan, you were cut off for a few seconds there.
Okay, that's the internet of the Hebrew University.
Can you go back to the trucks? I guess that's where you.
Yeah, I was saying that what I'm going to say is mainly about the period before March 2025, before Israel started cut the food aid to Gaza for 2 months. I'll speak about this later. The IPC and several UN agencies claimed that there was famine or near famine in Gaza already in 2024, though this declaration was not yet formal. And you could read it all over in the media. Actually, if you rely on the IPC is United Nations Integrated Phase Classification, that's the authority which is responsible for declaring famine. According to the IPC projections in 2024, around, depends how you define, how you count, between 20,000 and 120,000 people should have died of famine in 2024 alone. The real number, according to Hamas Ministry of Health, is 70. Not 70,000, not 7,000, not 770, which is not far away from numbers in Egypt or the United States or other countries in which there is no war. So these famine declarations were false, empirically. And we know they were false because they relied on several false assumptions, which we try to decode. The United Nations and human rights organizations claimed that before the war, 500 aid trucks entered Gaza daily, out of which there were, differed according to version, let's say 150 food trucks. Some people say 170, some people say 300. And therefore, anything less than 500 trucks a day means starvation. That was the basic assumptions of the United Nations and human rights organizations throughout the war, and this is tracing back to a tweet of the UN Secretary General. But when you actually check the UN data, you discover that before the war, only 73 food trucks per day entered Gaza. Not 500, not 150, 73. And there was no famine before the war. How do we know it? Because infant mortality it was declining in Gaza in the same rate that it declined in the West Bank and in Egypt. And also life expectancy was just, I said that there was no famine in Gaza before the war because life expectancy was rising and infant mortality was declining in virtually the same rate as elsewhere in the region. And so the calculations were wrong because we had the wrong baseline. That's what I was trying to argue when it cut off. So during the war, how many trucks entered Gaza? Food trucks. Even under a strict estimate, only 82 to 109 food trucks per day are required. Why more than 73? Because of disruptions due to the war and all sorts of other reasons. In reality, Israel permitted a significantly higher volume, sufficient not only in calories, but across nutritional metrics. And some people say, okay, but local production in Gaza was destroyed. We calculated local production in Gaza, it amounts to 10 food trucks per day. Something like that. It was not 44 calorie consumptions, that's a mistake. We explain in our report. So the starvation allegations relied on free-flowed assumptions and all fail under empirical scrutiny. And you know what? It was not difficult to discover it. You just need a laptop, a mouse, and browse into the UN OCHA website and check the actual numbers. And yet, virtually everybody quoted numbers which were plainly wrong. This is the real pre-war figures. You can see how we calculated what we calculated. Now, see what repercussions this mistake about the 500 trucks had. This is a decision of the International Court of Justice. You would think this is an institution which is committed to rigorous empirical examination of the facts. And I will not read the entire declaration, but look at the words I highlighted. This remains wholly insufficient, what the food that Israel gave to Gaza, and well below the pre-October 2023 average of approximately 500 trucks per day. So you see, this mistake had legal repercussions. By the way, I want to tell you, actually, I'm always asking audiences that I speak with, how many countries facilitated the entry of significant amounts of humanitarian aid to enemy-held territory in wartime? Regardless of how you interpret international law, which is a little bit complicated on this question, one, Israel. Virtually nobody else. So you see that not only that Israel supplied Gaza during the war, more than before the war, it was virtually the only country in known military history that did a similar thing for an extended period of time, at least that I know of. Maybe other people would give me examples that I don't know of. Certainly not to an enemy population. And again, you see how this mistake of the 500 trucks, which again was the baseline for the entire family of arguments about starvation. This is UN Secretary General that said, of course, it's much below the baseline, so there must be famine. And he said, you know, this is the highest number of people facing catastrophic hunger ever recorded by the IPC system anywhere, any time, meaning since 2003. Think about the famine in Somalia, in Yemen, in South Sudan, you know, hundreds of thousands of people suffering from famine. This is completely absurd. But now see how the Secretary General was quoted. The Secretary General said it's the worst famine since 2003, ever recorded by the IPC system. This is quoted by the World Food Programme. According to a new report, the Gaza Strip is seeing the highest number of people ever recorded as facing catastrophic hunger. You know, more than the hundreds of millions of people in the Great Leap Forward in China. You see how the mistake is being compounded, and you can see it also in the IPC arrest warrants. Again, this is a legal document. 1 million people in Gaza are facing catastrophic hunger, the highest number of people ever recorded anywhere, any time. So they couldn't the ICC prosecutor couldn't even quote the Secretary General. Right. This is what we call in Hebrew a broken phone. A mistake is being compounded by rumor. Again, you see how the mistake is passing from the UN to human rights organizations. This is from the Amnesty Genocide report. Again, I won't read the entire quote, but see again the highlighted word. Before October 7th, an average 500 trucks entered Gaza every day. You can see this is a random collection of media reports quoting the same wrong baseline. Another example, I won't read them all, but these are a very respectable media outlets which should do fact-checking. BBC, Washington Post, Guardian, Newsweek, again Guardian, you see New York Times, Le Monde, the Washington Post. Next time somebody tells you about the fact-checking in the New York Times, tell them that they cannot even enter OCHA website and look at the numbers and use a calculator. It is as bad. We summarize the way this 500 trucks fatal mistake was compounded from the UN to the IPC, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Reuters, and affiliated academics, Lee Mordechai, Shmulik Lederman, Omer Bartov, Alex Deval, especially Alex Deval, a very eminent expert. Expertise doesn't immune you from falling into such things. We think that the epistemological process is working as follows. First, an error enters the humanitarian ecosystem. It is being circulated, as you see in this chart. And then comes the thing I warn my interlocutors most from, the quoting of authoritative sources without verification. And then a year after the error becomes apparent to those who made it, false numbers still circulate widely. By the way, the UN stopped speaking about the 500 trucks in around summer 2024, but the number is still quoted. Then look at another issue. In May 2024, the United Nations reports, especially UNRWA and OCHA, that there was a 70% drop in humanitarian aid due to the Rafah operation. I implore you to remember the context. The Rafah operation, stopping the Rafah operation in spring 2024, was a major goal of activist pro-Palestinian organizations worldwide. The ICC arrest warrants were part of it, and another part of it was the argument that due to the operation, there was a drop of 70% in the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, a very, very grave accusation, because again, it can cause famine. This is the allegation. You see the graphs here. This is the UN data. You see the drop in May. But you see something very interesting. According to COGAT, there was no drop. COGAT is the IDF authority responsible of facilitating the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. So we as scholars saw a very interesting discrepancy between two sources. How could it be that the United Nations is consistently reporting much lower numbers than COGAT? And the answer became apparent to us very quickly. The United Nations does not count all trucks. It doesn't count state aid. It doesn't count commercial trucks. It doesn't count trucks that come through organizations which are not affiliated with the United Nations. And it counts trucks that come to certain warehouses only in certain hours. How do we know it? Because the UN retroactively corrected the data after a few months, writing in very tiny letters, which you need to use a magnifying glass to see, retroactive changes may apply. And the data was retroactively corrected in a way showing that COGAT was right all along. But here we come to another mistake. Mistakes are being pronounced very loudly. The 500 trucks number, the 70% drop in humanitarian aid. When they are being corrected, they are corrected silently. Retroactive data changes may apply in tiny numbers, in tiny letters. And it's like in a newspaper, you know that when a newspaper makes a mistake, it's on a headline, and when they apologize, it's on page 20 in small letters in the bottom after the obituaries. So this is a very similar phenomenon. And again, this had repercussions. This is the reason, the mistake in the numbers of trucks entering, the fallacious assumption that there was a 70% drop in the entry of aid to Gaza, fueled famine predictions by the IPC and the FRC, the Famine Review Committee, which is the body that should actually declare a state of famine. The FRC expects the upward trend in non-trauma mortality to accelerate and for all famine thresholds to be passed imminently. All evidence point towards a major acceleration of deaths and malnutrition. The FRC concludes that famine is imminent unless there is an immediate cessation of hostilities. Again, remember the context. We are trying to stop the Rafah operation. There was not an immediate cessation of hostilities, and there was not a famine. And we shouldn't be surprised again because the data was just wrong. This is another interesting example of how famine mistakes in Gaza are being compounded. The IPC report wrote in May 2025 nearly 71,000 cases of acute malnutrition among children 6 to 59 months, including 14,100 severe cases, are expected to occur between April 2025 and March 2026. This is something like 1 year, 11 months. Tom Fletcher, the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, consecutively tweeted, there are 14,000 babies that will die in the next 48 hours unless we can reach them. I want you to, he's relying on the IPC. I want you to check, to look again at these two quotations and see what happened here. Children turned to babies, and 1 year was being contracted into 48 hours. Acute malnutrition became death. And of course, The Guardian, the UN says that 14,000 babies will die in the next 48 hours. This is yet another example to the broken phone phenomenon. Now I want to say something about, I think, the worst blunder that Israel did in the war, which was to stop food, to stop humanitarian aid from March 2025 to, I would say, late May. The idea was to restart the aid distribution system to prevent Hamas aid diversion. Israel believed that there is enough aid in Gaza to last until midsummer. The reason they believed it was that OCHA and UNRWA had very similar assumptions, if you look at their numbers. Because during the ceasefire, Gaza received the second ceasefire in winter 2025, Gaza received around 600 trucks per day, which is way, 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 way above what Gaza needs. But actually the food was wasted, much was spoiled, much was looted, and food started to run out in April already, and certainly in May, and the Gaza Humanitarian Fund established by Israel was a failed enterprise, unfortunately, because I think that the intentions were good, but the implementation was not. And let me be very plain. In around July, there was a real food crisis in Gaza. There was a lot of suffering, and I think that had Israel not declared a humanitarian pause for 10 hours every day and just flooded Gaza with food, starting from late May, but actually in July, there would have been a famine in Gaza. I think it was maybe one more month like that, or a few weeks. It was relatively close, and this was an unforgivable blunder. Luckily, they burned their fingers with playing with this fire, but they were able to stop it on time and just flood Gaza with food. What's very interesting to say here is that what actually limits food truck entry to Gaza, the number, is not security clearings of the trucks. This is a very common mistake. It's active fighting. When you need to coordinate the movement of every truck with units that fight in numerous places, there is a certain cap on the trucks that can enter every day. That is the reason that Israel virtually sacrificed military advantage to correct its previous blunder and just let food enter Gaza. And yet the IPC declared that there is a famine level 5 in Gaza. IPC 5 means, in the conditions of Gaza, that 400 people should die per day. Per day. This is actually the number for the entire war. 2 years. Even according to Hamas Ministry of Health, and much of the data was, in our opinion, faked. They just included children with rare diseases and things like that. But even according to Hamas, the numbers were not even close to what the IPC said. And here, me and several colleagues advised the Foreign Ministry checking the IPC report in detail And this is what we discovered. I will not speak about the MUOC thresholds. This is relatively complicated. I will just I can answer about it in the Q&A if you want, but I'll mention the other points. Imagine we are all scientists here. Imagine you publish a scientific article and one of the peer reviewers discovers that the data set is wrong, that your conclusions do not flow from the data set. And then you tell the journal, oh, I have a different data set that I didn't show you so far. The conclusions actually flow from the second data set. The result would be immediate retraction. But this is the IPC, so scientific standards do not apply. The numbers just didn't sit with the conclusions. Then I think the worst, a worse blunder was that the sampling to check the malnutrition rates in Gaza was done in a way that would fail any student in any first-year course. What they did was biased sampling. So they sampled malnutrition in malnutrition clinics, where the children that go to malnutrition clinics are not representative of the entire population. Probably they suffer from something. So this is a biased sample. And this is against the IPC technical manual, and they violated it in a way which is, in my opinion, outrageous. It's like making an opinion poll for US politics in a Donald Trump rally. Statistically, this is the same. And they cherry-picked food service. I won't get into that, but I think the worst thing is that they didn't have any evidence for mortality. They just assumed there is mortality. And now many, many months had passed, and there was not mortality of 200, even 100, even 50 people per day. Never existed. So they declared a famine without absence of more evidence of mortality from malnutrition, and there was no exponential growth. This is another lie. If you check the numbers, you see they don't sit with one another, and they also ignored evidence of improvement. Me and my colleagues warned the Israeli government that food should enter Gaza immediately if you want to avoid famine. Why? Because we saw the prices spiking. The most important indicator for famine is food prices, which are rising very, very quickly. And when the IPC report was published, you saw that food prices were diving again, and they completely ignored it. This is about starvation. And I hope I convinced you so far, not that there was not a lot of suffering in Gaza, there was a lot of deprivation, everybody agrees about it, but the arguments about deliberate starvation and famine just don't sit well with the evidence. The second thing I want to say is the missing context of urban warfare. And in my reading of sources as a military historian, I'm amazed that so many studies written about the Gaza war treats the Gaza war as a unilateral activity of Israel. Omer Bartov, the historian Omer Bartov, writes it actually quite explicitly. Israel did it. Israel killed. Israel destroyed. Hamas never appears. If Hamas appears, it's usually a generic condemnation of October 7th. In the beginning of such reports. But after October 7th, Hamas disappears. Israel is alone in Gaza. But wars are interactive activities. Each side influences the other. And you cannot understand what the IDF did in Gaza without understanding how Hamas fought, and this is what we try to do in our second chapter. And we compare Gaza to other urban campaigns. I don't need to tell you, urban warfare is inherently and always destructive, and even more so with tunnels. Because if you have tunnels, you have to destroy everything above the tunnels in order to deal with the tunnels. In Gaza, we have maybe the most dense tunnel system ever recorded in history. In such a dense territory, when I started writing the research with my colleagues, we believe with 500 kilometers. Then we corrected ourselves to 700 kilometers. Now I heard 1,000. And the number is rising. Maybe North Korea as well. We don't know. So the result is almost always total destruction. When you ask why Gaza was destroyed, look at any other scene of urban warfare and see the result. This is, ladies and gentlemen, a picture from Nahar el-Bared, a Lebanese refugee camp in which in 2007 the Lebanese government fought an Islamist faction. No tunnels, and yet look at the camp. The entire camp was destroyed. As I showed you this picture, you could have thought it was Zaytun or Jabalia. And this is again without tunnels. Hamas human shield strategy intentionally compounds civilian harm. A scholar of international law called Jeff Korn, which I deeply appreciate, even thinks that human shields is not a proper designation of what Hamas did in this war. Because legally speaking, using human shields, which is a war crime, means that you are stacking civilians into military assets in order to protect them. Hamas did also that. But what it also did was to expose civilians intentionally to danger, to increase civilian casualties and get Israel into trouble in the international scene. How do I know it? Because they said it. Several Hamas leaders said it. We quote them. Musa Abu Marzouk, one of the leaders of Hamas, was asked, why didn't you build shelters for the civilian population? Why don't you let them into your tunnels? 1,000 kilometers of tunnels. By the way, air raid shelters are extremely effective in protecting civilians. And then Abu Marzouk said, it's not our responsibility. It's the responsibility of Israel and the United Nations. So another thing we check in great detail, we show that first of all, most transgressions of IDF soldiers in Gaza, and there are suspected war crimes that we discovered. We do not claim that IDF behavior in Gaza was even close to being perfect, but most transgressions were in this gray zone. What do I mean? In almost all of the cases where we discovered things that we suspect that might have been war crimes, this was typically during the clearing of houses, ambushes where soldiers expected to see enemies and they saw civilians and they shot them anyway, civilians that got too close to the troops, and especially civilians that entered forbidden zones. But why was it the case? Because Hamas tactics is to use civilian clothes, get very close to soldiers, taking weapons out of small caches, which are everywhere in Gaza, in kindergartens, in schools, in hospitals, everywhere, in private houses, and then shoot the soldiers from up close. In such situations, many soldiers are very easy on the trigger because they fear what may come next. I'm not saying it in order to justify things which, in my opinion, transgressed against international law, but as a military historian to understand the context why they occur. What we did not see in this war, and this is very important, I don't have evidence. Again, I'm saying I don't have evidence. I don't say it didn't happen. I don't have evidence for frontal massacres. That is, IDF soldiers taking civilians, putting them against the wall and mowing them down. I didn't see evidence of close-range executions. And I didn't see evidence of killing prisoners, bounded prisoners. Why it's important? Because in other Middle Eastern conflicts, like October 7th, like the clashes in the Alawite coast in Syria, like the clashes in Sueda in Syria recently, you have dozens of clips of frontal massacres and shooting prisoners from up close, even from a few hours of fighting. And you don't have it here. And it tells something on the nature or the patterns of transgressions that you saw in this war and what you didn't see. And yet, most people who died in the Gaza war died from bombings. not from soldiers up close, because the Gaza war was very heavy in bombing in dense urban environment. Okay. Here we checked several questions, and quantitative analysis comes very handy here because the numbers are very interesting. Some of Israel's critics said, okay, in the first 2 months of the war, Israel used enormous amount of ammunition. Usually the number is 26,000 pieces of ammunition, and the critics say this is more than the United States in the entire Iraq war. First of all, it is wrong, because they don't take 2003 into account, and most ammunition was used in the intensive phase of 2003. But leaving that aside, what does it tell us that so many pieces of ammunition were used? About 1/3 of the Gazans killed in the war were killed in these first 2 months. Actually, it was going down quite steadily afterwards. Because back then, the Hamas defensive positions were still intact. So you had to use a lot of bombings, especially because also there were many booby-trapped houses. And yet, had Israel wanted to kill as many civilians as possible and was even indifferent, it would have used less, not more pieces of ammunition. And I'll explain why. In Gaza, in such a dense area as Gaza, one piece of ammunition could easily kill hundreds of people. The ratio of casualties per piece of ammunition in the first 2 months, and these were the most deadly months of the war, was less than one casualty per piece of ammunition. This actually shows a pattern of precision targeting and operational restraint. Because Israel at the time was starved of ammunition, it had other fronts, it faced an international embargo, and it wanted to kill many civilians, it would have shot fewer pieces of ammunition into dense areas. Using a lot of pieces of ammunition actually shows a pattern of precision striking. Then, this is very, very important. I think Israel is the only power in world history that I know of that used a precise warning to civilians to evacuate battle zones. Town-level warnings existed in other wars, such as in Fallujah in Iraq, but this was usually leave the town. Not this street should evacuate or this house should evacuate. Why it's important? Because such precise evacuation orders are detrimental to military advantage. Why they are detrimental? Because you are losing the element of surprise. You are telling your enemy exactly where you are going to bomb. And yet Israel did it, maybe the only power in world history, in order to spare civilians and try to move civilians into safe zones. Here it's very important to note that there are many ways to protect civilians in urban warfare. The best way by far is to get them out of the war zone. All other ways are significantly inferior. In the Chechnya, in the Grozny battle, in the Chechen war, for example, more ethnic Russians were killed by the Russian army than Muslim Chechens. And you can ask yourself why. The reason was because the Russian army did not have any interest to kill ethnic Russians. The reason is that Muslim Chechens had relatives in the countryside. So they could escape the city, and ethnic Russians did not. If you are inside urban warfare, you will be armed. And the tragedy in Gaza, that unlike in southern Lebanon, did you ever ask yourself why there were fewer casualties in southern Lebanon? Way fewer casualties, though it was the same IDF and an enemy which is similar to Hamas, because Lebanese Shiite could escape the battle zone, Gazans could not. The international community virtually imprisoned them inside Gaza. I think that irresponsible comments of Israeli ministers brought the specters of ethnic cleansing, and that's why this decision was made, but it was extremely cruel to the population of Gaza. The UN also did not encourage Gazans to go into the humanitarian zones that Israel declared. And this is another important point. Legally, humanitarian zones in war or safe zones should be a mutual decision of both belligerents. I occupy this town without harming anybody, like Manila in 1942, for example. I occupy the town without arming anybody, and the enemy retreats from this town. This is called open town or safe zones. Hamas never agreed not to shoot from safe zones and actually shot hundreds of rockets from the safe zones. And here the United Nations said, okay, Israel gave warnings, there were safe zones, but the warnings were very imprecise, they were confusing, and the safe zones were actually death zones, where more civilians were killed. Well, we checked this out using numbers of BBC Verify and other numbers that we found in Palestinian studies, actually. And we proved statistically that evacuation orders significantly reduced civilian risk. In a sense, during much of the war, 50% of the population of Gaza was concentrated in the safe zones. And in the period we studied, around April 2024 to January 2025, to the second ceasefire, only 2 to 4% of reported casualties occurred in the humanitarian zones, to which over half of the population relocated. It means that civilians are way safer, 6 times safer actually in the safe zones than anywhere else. And again, the IDF employed extensive precautionary measures, advanced warnings, delays, aborted strike. At some points, around 50 to 60% of the strikes were delayed or aborted due to excessive collateral damage in a systematic effort to minimize civilian harm. To conclude, nothing that I said here should not mitigate the terrible human tragedy and the terrible human toll of the war in Gaza. Civilians in Gaza suffered immensely. They suffered from bombings. They suffered from deprivation. Many innocents died in the war. Sometimes IDF commanders were criminally negligent. Sometimes they were overbearing. Sometimes they did not check enough. Sometimes they were indifferent. But all in all, Israel made measures sacrificing military advantage in order to minimize the killing of civilians. That at least shows that we can speak about other war crimes, but we are not in the zone of genocide. So if so, why did this false conclusion was created? And we have a model we call the inverted funnel of information. You see that except anti-Hamas critics of Palestinians in Gaza, which are usually not heeded by the international community, information from Gaza comes from several sources, virtually all of which are controlled and manipulated by Hamas, which shouldn't surprise us because Gaza is a totalitarian society. People in the West tend to assume that if a doctor in the Netherlands, for example, doesn't care really what the Dutch government thinks, right? He's a professional, he may have his own professional opinion. This is not true for doctors in Gaza. This is not true for bloggers in Gaza. This is not true for professors in Gaza. This is a totalitarian society. And most of the things that come out to journalists, to NGOs, to international organizations is coming through these filters of Hamas. Foreign journalists who entered Gaza when they could enter Gaza before the war, and to rely on Hamas fixers in order to make meetings. They were really not independent on the ground. What we try to show is that sources are filtered through the resistance narrative and through what we call the humanitarian bias. Humanitarian organizations feel the duty to protect. Just like the manager of a hospital will never tell the finance ministry, I have enough budget, don't give me more budget next year. People who manage organizations tend to always to say that we are in a crisis. And for humanitarian organizations in Gaza, the number one priority was to stop the war. And therefore, they gave alarmist numbers. And Gaza is not the first time they did it, by the way. And because they gave alarmist numbers, these were quoted by international media, UN, human rights NGOs, and a consensus emerged. And if you open your internet, you could see thousands of sources speaking about famine in Gaza and IDF massacres in Gaza and deliberate starvation and indiscriminate bombings and frontal massacres. But when you check what the sources are based on, you see this inverted funnel of information. What seems like a very wide variety of sources is actually relying on a very narrow base of contaminated sources. Unfortunately, they also enter Wikipedia, and through Wikipedia, they enter the AI engines. And of course, when people write new reports, they use the AI engines, and the mistake is being perpetuated. I just want to say something that I forgot before because I think it's very important. We checked very, very closely the allegations of volunteer doctors that snipers shot children in the head every day, and we just show that it's incongruent with at least 7 studies, Palestinian and international studies of injury patterns in Gaza. So I'll end here, and I'm open for all of your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Danny. This was fascinating, and I think people would be love to hear even more. I'd like to open this to the general questions of our guests, but I have to start with one comment of my own, which is you mentioned in the beginning of your talk that this actually despite all the criticisms of Israel for not providing enough food, Israel's actually the only country that ever allowed food to
That's
be
true.
given at all. And I think that's really an extraordinary fact that really kind of makes the rest of the discussion almost, I won't say irrelevant, but because you said several times during your talk that this would be very severe if Israel had done this. And yet, compared to the norm in these situations, even if Israel hadn't provided any food, they wouldn't have been breaking the norms. And I'm wondering
Actually,
why this, what?
the military manuals of the United Nations and the United States actually allow a belligerent not to give food if there is a fear that it will fall into enemy hand.
Which we knew was happening.
Even recent manuals, there is a very serious legal debate. I won't get into it. It's quite complicated, whether you need to supply food also in such cases. But even if you need, the fact is that belligerents usually don't do it, certainly not in intensive wars.
So,
But I want to use your question to note something which I think is very, very important. The biggest problem in international law and international humanitarian discourse in general is that it distorts incentives. And if you're economists here, they know what I'm speaking about. So just like that, blaming Israel for casualties when Hamas is using a human shield strategy, is actually giving an incentive to future terror organizations to double down on the human shields policy, thus increasing humanitarian suffering. But what you said, it's another kind of a distorted incentive, because Israel discovered again and again and again that whenever it is using a standard which is above and beyond the requirements of international law and international custom, this becomes self-evident. And we don't get credit for it, right? But their bar is getting higher. So the incentive it's actually counter incentive to humanitarian behavior. And this is something I'd like to point out. Yes, I see
let me just
Ricardo. Yes,
excuse me. Let me just finish my question, and then I will definitely open it up to the whole group. So there's two things in which Israel went above and beyond, which was first of all allowing all the food in, and secondly, as you pointed out, um, uh, giving warnings, giving detailed, specific warnings to people. Um, and as you say, no recognition for that. No, we're not going to get a Nobel Peace Prize for this. That's not going to happen. But at the other side, and this is something you also, I think Deborah Glazer mentioned this, several factors that compounded the problem, even though, as I believe you'll agree, the numbers even even the terrible tragedy that did occur was minor compared to some of the tragedies that have occurred in the region. But what did compound the problem was the fact, as far as I know, this is only the second time in history that refugees have been forcibly prevented from fleeing the war
Absolutely, I
zone.
mentioned it
You mentioned
explicitly.
it. The first time was the Holocaust, where people refused to allow Jewish refugees to enter their countries when they were fleeing from the war. And the second, and that was because they hated the Jews and didn't want them there. One didn't want them to escape. And I would suggest that the second case of preventing refugees is Gaza. It didn't happen in the Ukraine. I don't know of any places where refugees were forcibly prevented from fleeing. And the reason why they were prevented from fleeing from Gaza was the same reason as in the Holocaust, because people hate the Jewish people. They didn't do it because they hated the Palestinians. They did it because they didn't want the Jewish people to be able to fight this war in a less lethal way.
I won't comment on the issue of anti-Semitism. It's a very serious issue, but I think it requires a different talk. Let's just focus
Okay.
on the situation in the Gaza war. Let's open it to questions.
So I have Matthew first and then Ricardo. And I want to just say if anybody wants to write a private question, you can write it to me and then I will ask on your behalf.
Yes, this is Matthew Diamond. Thank you very much for this very brilliant report. And I appreciate a lot that the emphasis in what you present was on numbers. You just went to objective data, and I think that that's absolutely a very strong approach to this problem. But sometimes we stray beyond the numbers to really consider what is a genocide. And along those lines, I would suggest an argument that we don't hear about very frequently, which is that we know that genocides have existed in history. It's a real thing. It really has happened. But to my knowledge, and I've tried to think of existing real cases, there's never been one in which the action of the alleged perpetrator of genocide ceased to exist. The action stopped at the moment of an agreement between the perpetrator and the victim. And we know that Israel began its military action with basically, just to boil it down to two things: release of the hostages and elimination of the military existential threat of Hamas. These were two things that Israel required. And the moment that there was an agreement, even the promise, not the execution of these conditions, but the agreement that we'll basically try to do this, the so-called genocide stopped. And this has never happened. There's never been a genocide where the perpetrator just stops when its conditions are met.
This is also true, but there are so many things to say, as I said before, about the the trying to minimize casualties and so many other things that, turns it ridiculous. But what I want to emphasize in response to your comment is that there is a very dangerous tendency in scholarship that we see in the last 2 decades, and this is true to two diverse fields as genocide studies and nutrition studies, the IPC. It becomes blurry. If you look at genocide studies today, they speak about the twists and turns of genocidal intent, and they speak about genocide that does not require mortality. And the IPC has famine definitions, which since 2021 actually, are so nebulous that you can actually work with zero data. So the problem is that scholarship was corrupted, and it was corrupted by becoming unempirical.
Okay, I have Ricardo Gans.
Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and also the report is very interesting. I still haven't finished reading, but what I've read, it's really interesting, and it should really be spread around. So my question actually is connected with the previous question, which touches on the genocide thing, because your report does a wonderful job of explaining data, facts, arguments. However, when Israel is accused, it is, in my opinion at least, more of an emotional accusation, which draws from a little bit of data, but at the end of the day, it ends with the following definition: genocide is what Israel did in Gaza. So, what would your answer be to this kind of argument, especially because it is very, very widespread, not only within like militant ranks, but within governments, within international agents, and so on?
I think
Thank
that
you.
most of these people cannot be convinced. People who are diehards for the other side, this is not my audience. My audience is the undecided. And also people who are sympathetic of Israel, but are very distraught by what they see. So I want to give them facts and numbers. The best thing you can do, and again, this is mostly for the undecided, is emphasizing again and again Israel sacrificed military advantage to protect civilians. If I should have one message to give against the genocide accusation, this will be the one, and I would add, and gave 2 million tons of aid to Gaza's population. I think this too is what I would emphasize.
So we have a question for Shale, but there are many people who are asking about your slides, whether you're going to share your slides with
I
us
can,
after
but
the
I would
talk.
like to say, to add a note, that if you quote from it, please quote the full report. And, because it's just better than quoting the slides.
Perfect. Thank you. Shale, you're next.
Hi, Dan. I'd just like to ask you to comment on one thing which really came through strongly in your talk. That is, there were so many flagrant cases of claims which just obviously turned out to be false, like thousands of babies dying in the next 48 hours, or hunger is already underway, and then there were no significant numbers of hunger casualties. And yet there doesn't seem to have been any consequence, not only for the reputations of these people, but these claims continue to be believed. So what can one say about this, Dan?
I think these people their shame should always be reminded again and again and again, because why do we have corrupted scholarship? Because people who behaved in an unscholarly way do not suffer the consequences. And this is true also for the IPC. Even Israeli epidemiologists were extremely careful of saying anything bad about the IPC. And this is the reason that much scholarship, it doesn't worth its dime any longer, unfortunately. Because I believe our job as scientists is to make the world clearer, not to make the world blurrier. And we are committed to ethics, and I think that people who violate these ethics should suffer at least reputational consequences, at least.
I don't have any questions in the chat. I have a question, but I don't know if you want to answer it. What do you think is fueling the misinformation? Is it the anti-Semitism is fueling the misinformation, or is the misinformation fueling the anti-Semitism? It seems like you can't separate them.
I think that speaking about anti-Semitism would distract us a bit, because the fact that a person is an anti-Semite doesn't mean that he is not telling the truth. By the way, also the fact that a person is a Hamas activist doesn't mean he's not telling the truth. It means we need to be suspicious, and we need to check, and we need to cross-verify. For me, it's way more important to prove that we are wrong than to prove that we are anti-Semites. But I would say something important. I think that political opinions of people, even anti-Semitism, would matter much less if science would be clear and transparent and data-based. You know, in the past, you had anti-Semitic scholars who were great scholars, and we are reading them to these days, even though they were anti-Semitic, because at least you have data-based insights in the writing. But as scholarship and international activism and United Nations work became so blurry, so ambiguous, so liable of manipulation, in such cases, the political biases of, let's say, the IPC committee members matter a lot. And let me horrify all of you. We checked the Twitter accounts of some of the IPC committee members. The IPC is not Amnesty International. It's not a left wing, it shouldn't be a radical activist organization. This is a respected UN body of nutritionists that should check if there is famine. It's very important work. And you see that among 7 committee members who wrote the reports, 1 justified the Houthis, another justified October 7th. So if the science was robust, it wouldn't matter as much. But when science is ambiguous, it matters a hell of a lot.
Thank you.
I think Alexander has a question.
Yes. And yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for a very thorough and, I would say very well laid out empirical report, and you were able to distill, I think, the key points very effectively in your presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. One is the term genocide. There seems to be kind of a slide in how easily the term is applied, just generally. So, I mean, what not only in the case of Israel, but I mean, we hear regularly that the Spanish carried out genocide in the New World, and that America was founded on genocide of the Indians. And I'm not sure that and this is widespread.
Russia and Ukraine are blaming one another.
Yeah, I mean, it's become.
Israel made a continuous genocide
originally
since 1948.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just wondering, like, how much just the weaponization of the term, including within university academic, the politicization of academia has played a role. And I guess my other question is a little bit like what Sophia was asking. Let's not talk about anti-Semitism necessarily, but how much does, because your funnel theory kind of portrayed it as kind of almost accidental, and I'm not saying it's not. I'm just curious your opinion. Are people? How much does ideology in the UN and NGOs and other things like that play a role in sort of unwillingness to scrutinize?
So two
claims?
things.
So
First of all, your first question. Richard Southern is an amazing historian, in my opinion, of the medieval Catholic Church. And in one of his articles, he coined an amazing term, which is the inflation of ideas. And he used the indulgences. The indulgences of the Catholic Church, for those who don't know, in the Middle Ages, you could pay for religious purposes and get forgiveness for your sins. Of course, if you make ablution and if you get repentance and other things. When the church distributed a few indulgences, they were treated very seriously by people. It could bring you to heaven. It was a life-changing event. But when the church wanted to make more money and distributed more and more indulgences, just like when a government is printing money, there was an inflation in the importance of indulgences, and then came Martin Luther and the Reformation. What I'm saying here is that what Southern said about medieval indulgences is true for any term or idea. Fascism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, genocide, crimes against humanity. Take what you will. You use it too much, the value will go down. And I think that's what's happening now with genocide. For people who I otherwise appreciate a lot, like the author David Grossman, saying that there is a genocide is another way of saying that you are unhappy with what Israel is doing in Gaza. So they don't really think about the term, and that's the problem. To your second question, not everyone needs to be anti-Semitic. That's a key point for the inverted funnel of information to work. Qatar and other anti-Semitic forces need to occupy only a small number of influential positions, which I call junctions of reliability. My colleague Neta Barak-Oren calls it oracles, but it's the same thing. Imagine that you are now reading something on atrocities in East Timor. You know nothing about Indonesia or East Timor. You will usually rely on a source that seems reliable to you, media source, scholarly source. These are the oracles or the junctions of reliability. Well, for many Europeans, the UN is such a junction of reliability. Anything the UN says, it's true. And it's true for the ICJ and the ICC as well. That's why they are no real courts. They are not real courts, in my opinion. They treat UN reports as primary source, not as a secondary source. So it's enough to have a number of anti-Semites in these key positions for even people who are not anti-Semites to accept their positions. And that's how the inverse pattern of information works.
So in a
Thank you
way,
very much.
what's fueling this also is a lack of critical thinking.
Absolutely.
We have time for a few more questions or some comments. We have something in the chat. This research is important for the public in Israel that feels terrible because also citizens in Israel believe the genocide narrative.
I see. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Let me read the CD for more comment. Yeah, yeah, this is true. I see Matthew writes here that the definition of genocide is updated. So now you don't need special intention that cannot be interpreted in any other way. Dolus specialis in Latin. So when they changed the definition for Israel, you see that the definition is problematic. I see Hanoch is raising his hand.
Yes, I'd like to ask whether there's any new information accumulating after the end of your writing the English version of the report.
Just a moment, Hanoch, I don't hear you well. Can you speak more loudly?
Sure. Is it better now?
Just speak. No, I don't hear you well. Just speak more louder.
Okay, no
No,
problem.
no. Now I hear you well. Now I hear
Yes,
you well.
fine. Thanks. I would like to ask whether there's any new information has been accumulating since you have finished your English version of the report, something that adds something
Yes.
important to what's in the report. Thanks.
I'll send you the link through Gabriel. There is a study published by the Foreign Ministry to which I was one of the advisors called Politics Disguised as Science. This is a very extensive criticism of the IPC report of August 2025. It's important because it covers the food crisis in Gaza in the summer. I think that someone should write seriously about the GHF shooting incidents. We didn't do it yet, and we may hope to do it in the future. We are hoping to publish appendixes. We are publishing a new appendix of an opinion of a forensic doctor, a forensic physician, on the argument that CT images show bullets in the heads of children. We analyze it, we show that it's statistically untrue using injury patterns, but he actually analyzes the scans or the images themselves. And we will publish appendixes about
The
water.
conclusion is that these are not intentional shootings in the head.
The conclusion about the picture is that it's suspicious, but we cannot know for sure. The inclusion about the patterns is that if it happened, it was very rare. And certainly didn't happen daily, as you know, as they claimed. It doesn't sit with any number that was published out of the Gaza Strip. And we'll publish appendix about water, and we are always also correcting the report. It's an ongoing work.
Thanks very much.
Edward?
Edward has a question now.
Yeah, thank you. First, an apology and a regret. I had the time wrong, so I missed the talk. And that means that what I'm going to ask you may be something that you covered, and if that's the case, don't just let me know, and I'll don't bother. Uh, anyway, so here's the question. It seems to me that there was a kind of increase, a more inclusivity standard for genocide, and that is that instead of having the evidence that various acts were committed, just the calling for genocide is now counting for genocide. And
Yeah, now I was able to get in again.
Hi, Dan. Okay, so Ed, do you want to finish your question?
yeah. Okay. I just wanted the question I wanted to raise, Dan, is whether this redefinition of genocide to include not just the acts, and the acts seem to be what you focus on in the report, but also the claims, the statements that ministers in a government would make, or a government would make, and how that really has affected the claims against Israel, and whether there's any remedy for that, what to do about it, and the extent to which it's been harmful to Israel.
How do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, that's perfect.
I'm saying that according to the dolus specialis requirement, it has to be policy, so not any minister would count. It needs to be someone who could actually order the army, and it needs to be something which is beyond, the normal boasting that you have a war, I'll bring a destruction, Hamas will pay a dear price. It needs to be something which could not be interpreted in any other way. And many of the things which are often used, like things that Gallant or Netanyahu or Herzog said, the sentences are just stopped midway because then you see that they meant Hamas and all the entire Palestinian population. So many of his quotes are distorted, and others are of people who cannot order the army. That's in a nutshell.
I'm sure you're right. Was that included in your report? Because I didn't see it.
We have in the fourth chapter, we have a small section about it that we show that some of the quotes which are used often, especially of Netanyahu and Gallant, are distorted.
Okay.
In chapter 4.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, I think we should thank Dan for speaking to us, and really for spending hundreds or thousands of hours writing this report and investigating this. This is so important. This is probably the biggest issue today, and just my gratitude is endless. So thank you so much,
Gabriel, if I
Dan.
can ask something for the audience, you are all scientists here. I think that the expertise of some of you may relate to some angles of the Gaza war, or things that we write in the report. Our report is an invitation for further research. People could take our sources and just do their own work. There is an enormous amount of things to do. And as we have more peer-reviewed articles, or press articles, or magazine articles, telling the truth about what happened in Gaza, it will help the truth, first of all, in science and correct understanding of what happened, but also the state of Israel. And this is my call to all of you, each in his own field, continue our research and just continue the thread that we began.
I second that suggestion, and if anyone wants to do it, I'll be happy to support them and help them in any way I can.
And we too.
Gabriel, I know you're trying to close the meeting, but the final to your comment and Dan's comment raise one final thing. If I could just ask really quickly, Dan, what kind of feedback are you getting? I mean, besides death threats and things like that.
We don't get as much death threats, but we get a lot of poison from the radical left, especially in Israel, by the way.
Yeah.
More than in the world, even. We got some positive reviews, we got some negative reviews, but the report was not covered by the media as we thought it would be. That's the real answer. And that's why my appeal to all of you to continue. Because one report is not enough. There needs to be a body of scientific writing about the Gaza war. Only then we will be taken seriously.
Would you be willing to share maybe a list of topics that you'd like us to write about?
Sure, definitely.
So please send that to me and I will send it around.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Bye.
See you next time. Next time, we're going to do something on oikophobia, if that interests people.